The Western Philosophy by Will Durant, Chapter 10, Section 2. Benedetto Croci. Paragraph 1. The Man. From Bergson to Croci is an impossible transition. There is hardly a parallel in all their lines. Bergson is a mystic who translates his visions into deceptive clarity. Croci is a skeptic with an almost German gift for obscurity. Bergson is religiously minded and yet talks as a thorough going evolutionist. Croci is an anti-clerical who writes like an American Hegelian. Bergson is a French Jew who inherits the traditions of Spinoza and Lamarck. Croci is an Italian Catholic who has kept nothing of his religion except its scholasticism and its devotion to beauty. Perhaps the comparative infertility of Italy in the philosophy of the last 100 years is due in some part to the retention of scholastic attitudes and methods even by thinkers who have abandoned the old theology. More of it, doubtless, is due to the northward movement of industry and wealth. Italy might be described as the land that had a renaissance but never a reformation. It will destroy itself for beauty's sake, but it is as skeptical as Pilate when it thinks of truth. Perhaps the Italians are wiser than the rest of us and have found that truth is a mirage. While beauty, however subjective, is a possession and a reality, the artists of the Renaissance, excepting the somber and almost Protestant Michelangelo, whose brush was the echo of Savonarola's voice, never worried their heads about morals or theology. It was enough for them that the church recognized their genius and paid their bills. It became an unwritten law in Italy that men of culture would make no trouble for the church. How could an Italian be unkind to a church that had brought all the world to Canossa and had levied imperial tribute on every land to make Italy the art gallery of the world? So Italy remained loyal to the old faith and contented itself with the Summa of Aquina for philosophy. Giambattista Vico came and stirred the Italian mind again, but the Vico went, and the philosophy seemed to die with him. Rosmini thought for a time that he would rebel, but he yielded. Throughout Italy, men became more and more irreligious and more loyal to the church. Benedetto Croci is an exception. Born in 1866 in a small town in the province of Aquila, and the only son of a well to do Catholic and conservative family, he was given so thorough a training in Catholic theology what at last, to restore the balance, he became an atheist. In countries that have had no reformation, there is no halfway house between orthodoxy and absolute unbelief. Benedetto was at first so pious that he insisted on studying every phase of religion until at last he reached its philosophy and its anthropology, and insensibly his studies were substituted for his faith. In 1883, life dealt him one of those ruthless blows which usually turn men's minds back to belief. An earthquake overwhelmed the little town of Casamicciola, where the Croces were staying. Benedetto lost both his parents and his only sister. He himself remained buried for hours under the ruins, with many broken bones. It took him several years to recover his health, but this later life and work showed no breaking of his spirit. The quiet routine of convalescence gave him, or strengthened in him, the taste for scholarship. He used the modest fortune which the catastrophe left him to collect one of the finest libraries in Italy. He became a philosopher without paying the usual penalty of poverty or a professorship. He realized Ecclesiastes' cautious counsel that wisdom is good with an inheritance. He had remained throughout his life a student, a lover of letters and of leisure. It was against his protests that he was drawn into politics and made Minister of Public Education, perhaps to lend an air of philosophic dignity to a cabinet of politicians. He was chosen to the Italian Senate, and as the rule in Italy is once a senator, always a senator, the office being for life, Croce provides the spectacle not unusual in ancient Rome. but rather unique in our day, of a man who can be a senator and a philosopher at the same time. He would have interested Lago, but he does not take his politics too seriously. His time goes chiefly to the editing of his internationally famous periodical, La Critica, in which he and Giovanni Gentile dissect the world of thought and Bell's letters. When the War of 1914 came, Croci, angered at the thought that a mere matter of economic conflict should be permitted to interrupt the growth of the European mind, denounced the outbreak as suicidal mania, and even when Italy had of necessity thrown in her lot with the Allies, he remained aloof and became as unpopular in Italy as Bertrand Russell in England or Raymond Roland in France. But Italy has forgiven him now, and all the youth of the land to look up to him as their unbiased guide, philosopher, and friend. He has become for them an institution as important as the universities. It is nothing unusual how to hear judgments of him like Giuseppe Natoli. The system of Benedetto Croce remains the highest conquest in contemporary thought. Let us inquire into the secret of this influence. Part 2. The philosophy of the spirit. His first book, in its original form, was a leisurely series of articles. 1895 to 1900 on historical materialism and the economics of Karl Marx. He had been immensely stimulated by Antonio Labriola, his professor at the University of Rome. Under his guidance, Croci had plunged into the labyrinths of Marx's capital. Thus, intercourse with the literature of Marxism and the eagerness with which for some time I followed the socialistic press of Germany and Italy stirred my whole being, and for the first time awakened in me a feeling of political enthusiasm, yielding a strange taste of newness to me. I was like a man who, having fallen in love for the first time when no longer young, should observe in himself of mysterious process of the new passion. But the wine of social reform did not quite go to his head. He soon reconciled himself to the political absurdities of mankind and worshipped again at the altar of philosophy. One result of this adventure was his elevation of the concept utility to a parity with goodness. Beauty and truth, not that he conceded to economic affairs the supreme importance given to them in the system of Marx and Engels. He praised this man for a theory which, however incomplete, had drawn attention to a world of data before underrated and almost ignored, but he rejected the absolutism of the economic interpretation of history as an unbalanced surrender to the suggestions of an industrial environment. He refused to admit materialism as a philosophy for adults or even as a method for science. Mind was to him the primary and ultimate reality, and when he came to write his system of thought, he called it almost pugnaciously for Croci is an idealist and recognizes no philosophy since Hegel's. All reality is idea. We know nothing except in the form it takes in our sensations and our thoughts. Hence, all philosophy is reducible to logic, and the truth is the perfect relationship in our ideas. Perhaps Croce likes this conclusion a bit too well. He is nothing if not logical. Even in his book of aesthetics, he cannot resist the temptation to intrude a chapter on logic. It is true that he calls philosophy the study of the concrete universal and science the study of the abstract universal, but it is the reader's misfortune that Croce's concrete universal is universally abstract. He is, after all, a product of the scholastic tradition. He delights in abstruse distinctions and classification that exhaust both the subject and the reader. He slides easily into logical casuistry and refutes more readily than he can conclude. He is a Germanized Italian, as Nietzsche is an Italianized German. Nothing could be more German or more Hegelian than the title of the first of the trilogy that makes up the Philosophia dello Spirito di Logic as the science of the pure concept, 1905. Croce wants every idea to be as pure as possible, which seems to mean as ideological as possible, as abstract and pragmatic as possible. There is nothing here of that passion for clarity and practical content which made William gems, a beacon light amid the mists of philosophy. Croci does not care to define an idea by reducing it to its practical consequences. He prefers to reduce practical affairs to ideas, relations, and categories. If all abstract or technical words were removed from his books, they would not so suffer from obesity. By a pure concept, Croce means a universal concept like quantity, quality, evolution, or any thought which may conceivably be applied to all reality. He proceeds to juggle these concepts as if the spirit of Hegel had found in him another avatar, and as if he were resolved to rival the reputation of the master from obscurity by calling or this logic. Croce convinces himself that he scorns metaphysics and that he has kept himself immaculate from it. Metaphysics, he thinks, is an echo of theology, and the modern university professor of philosophy is just the latest form of the medieval theologian. He mixes his idealism with a certain hardness of attitude towards tender beliefs. He rejects religion. He believes in the freedom of the will, but not in the immortality of the soul. The worship of beauty and the life of culture are to him a substitute for religion. Their religion was the whole intellectual patrimony of primitive peoples. Our intellectual patrimony is our religion. We do not know what use could be made of religion by those who wish to preserve it side by side with the theoretic activity of man, with his art, his criticism, and his philosophy. Philosophy removes from religion all reason for existing as the science of the spirit. It looks upon religion as a phenomenon, a transitory historical fact, a psychic condition that can be surpassed. One wonders if La Gioconda's smile did not hover over the face of Rome when it read these words. We have here the unusual occurrence of a philosophy that is at once naturalistic and spiritualistic, agnostic and indeterministic, practical and idealistic, economic and aesthetic. It is true that Croce Instruct is caught more surely by the theoretical than by the pragmatic aspects of life. but the very subjects he has essayed bear witness to an honorable effort to overcome his scholastic inclination. He has written an immense volume of the philosophy of the practical, which turns out to be in part another logic under another name, and in part a metaphysical discussion of the old problem of free will, and in a more modest tome on history, he has achieved the fruitful conception of history as philosophy in motion, and of the historian as one who shows nature and man not in theory and abstraction, but in the actual flow and operation of causes and events. Croci loves his Vico and warmly seconds the earlier Italian's plea that history should be written by philosophers. He believes that the fetish of a perfectly scientific history has led to a microscopic erudition in which the historian loses the truth because he knows too much, just as Schliemann exhumed not only one Troy, but seven after scientific historians had shown that there had been no Troy at all. So Croce thinks the hypercritical historian exaggerates our ignorance of the past. I recollect the remark made to me when I was occupied with research work in my young days by a friend of but slight literary knowledge, to whom I had lent a very critical, indeed hypercritical, history of ancient Rome. When he had finished reading it, he returned the book to me, remarking that he had acquired the proud conviction of being the most learned of philologists, for the latter arrives at the conclusion that they know nothing as the result of exhausting toil, while he knew nothing without any effort at all, simply as a generous gift of nature. Croce recognizes the difficulty of finding out the actual past and quotes Rousseau's definition of history as the art of choosing from among many lies that one which most resembles the truth. He has no sympathy with the theorist who, like Hegel or Marx or Bacot, distorts the past into a syllogism that will conclude with his prejudice. There is no foreordained plan in history, and the philosopher who writes history must devote himself not to the tracing of cosmic designs, but to the revelation of causes and consequences and correlations, and he will also remember that only that part of the past is of value which is contemporary in its significance and its illumination. History might at last be what Napoleon called it, the only true philosophy and the only true psychology, if historians would write it as the apocalypse of nature and the mirror of man. The third part: what is beauty? By Benedetto Croci. Croci came to philosophy from historical and literary studies, and it was natural that his philosophic interest should be deeply colored by the problems of criticism and aesthetics. His greatest book is his Aesthetic, 1902. He prefers art to metaphysics and to science. The sciences give us utility, but the arts gives us beauty. The sciences take us away from the individual and the actual into a world of increasingly mathematical abstractions until, as in Einstein, they issue in momentous conclusions of no practical importance, but art takes us directly to the particular person and the unique fact, to the philosophical universal intuitive in the form of the concrete individual. Knowledge has two forms. It is either intuitive knowledge or logical knowledge, knowledge obtained through the imagination, or knowledge obtained through the intellect. Knowledge of the individual or knowledge of universal, of individual things or of the relations between them. It is the production either of images or of concepts. The origin of art, therefore, lies in the power of forming images. Art is ruled uniquely by the imagination. Images are its only wealth. It does not classify objects. It does not pronounce them real or imaginary, does not qualify them, does not define them. It feels and presents them, nothing more. Because imagination precedes thought and is necessary to it, the artistic or image forming activity of the mind is prior to the logical concept forming activity. Man is an artist as soon as he imagines and long before he reasons. The great artists understood the matter so. One paints not with the hands, but with the brain, said Michelangelo. And Leonardo wrote, "The minds of men of lofty genius are most active in invention when they are doing the least external work." Everybody knows the story told by Da Vinci that when he was painting the Last Supper, he sorely displeased the abbot who had ordered the work by sitting motionless for days before an untouched canvas, and revenged himself for the importunate abbot's persistent query, when would he begin to work, by using the gentleman as an unconscious model for the figure of Judas. The essence of the aesthetic activity lies in this motionlessness, effort of the artist to conceive the perfect image that shall express the subject he has in mind. It lies in a form of intuition that involves no mystic insight, but perfect sight, complete perception, and adequate imagination. The miracle of art lies not in the externalization, but in the conception of the idea. Externalization is a matter of mechanical technique and manual skill. When we have mastered the internal world, when we have vividly and clearly conceived a figure or a statue, when we have found a musical theme, expression is born and is complete. Nothing more is needed. If then we open our mouth and speak or sing, what we do is to say aloud what we have already said within, to sing aloud what we have already sung within. If our hands strike the keyboard of the pianoforte, if we take a pencil or chisel, such actions are willed. They belong to the practical, not to the aesthetic activity. And what we are then doing is executing in great movements what we have already executed briefly and rapidly within. Does this help us to answer that baffling question, what is beauty? Here, certainly, there are as many opinions as there are heads, and every lover in this matter thinks himself an authority not to be gainsaid. Croci answers that beauty is the mental formation of an image or a series of images that catches the essence of the thing perceived. The beauty belongs, again, rather to the inward image than to the outward form in which it is embodied. We like to think that the difference between ourselves and Shakespeare is larger a difference in technique of external expression that we have thoughts that lie too deep for words. But this is a fond illusion. The difference lies not in the power of externalizing the image, but in the power inwardly forming an image that expresses the object. Even that aesthetic sense, which is contemplation rather than creation, is also inward expression. The degree in which we understand or appreciate a work of art depends upon our ability to see by direct intuition the reality portrayed, our power to form for ourselves an expressive image. It is always our own intuition we express when we are enjoying a beautiful work of art. It can only be my own. Intuition. When reading Shakespeare, I form the image of Hamlet or Othello, both in the artist creating and in the spectator contemplating beauty. The aesthetic secret is the expressive image. Beauty is adequate expression, and since there is no real expression if it be not adequate, we may answer very simply the ancient question and say, beauty is expression. The fourth part, criticism. All this is as clear as a starless night, and not wiser than it should be. The philosophy of the spirit lacks spirit, and discourages a sympathetic exposition. The philosophy of the practical is unpractical and lacks the breadth of living reference. The essay on history catches one leg of the truth by proposing a union of history and philosophy, but it misses the other by failing to see that history can become philosophy only by being not analytic but sympathetic, not shredded history given in separate books. The separate story of the supposedly insulated activities of man, economic, political, scientific, philosophical, religious, literary, and artistic, but what one might call, not too seriously, wedded history, history in which all the phases of human life in a given period made as brief as individual frailty may require shall be studied in their correlation, in their common response to similar conditions, and in their varied mutual influence. That would be the picture of an age, the image of the complexity of man. It would be such history as a philosopher would consent to write. As to the aesthetic, let others judge. At least one student cannot understand it. Is man an artist as soon as he forms images? Does the essence of art lies only in the conception and not in the externalization? Have we never had thoughts and feelings more beautifully than our speech? How do we know what the inward image was? In the artist's mind, or whether the work that we admire realizes or misses his idea. How shall we call Rodin's harlot beautiful except because it is the expressive embodiment to an adequate conception, though it be of an ugly and distressing subject. Aristotle notes that it pleases us to see the faithful images of things that are repugnant to us in reality. Why, except that we reverence the art that has so well embodied the idea. It would be interesting and no doubt disconcerting to know what artists think of these philosophers who tell them what beauty is. The greatest living artist has abandoned the hope of answering the question. I believe, he writes, that we shall never know exactly why a thing is beautiful, but the same mellow wisdom offers us a lesson which we learned usually too late. No one has ever been able to show me precisely the right way. As for me, I follow my feeling for the beautiful. What man is certain of having found a better guide? If I had to choose between beauty and the truth, I should not hesitate. It is beauty I should keep. There is nothing true in the world except beauty. Let us hope that we need not choose. Perhaps we shall some day be strong enough and clear enough in soul to see the shining beauty of even the darkest truth. Today's part is over.